Hello, welcome back to this Greek series. I hope that lesson one was profitable and that you have learnt the Greek alphabet and understand some of the accent marks that go over the different letters. So today we're looking at lesson two, and here's an overview of what we're going to cover in this lesson. We're going to begin with characteristics of Greek verbs. Next we'll move on to the characteristics of Greek nouns. And in between, we'll also do some basic English. We'll look at English sentences and word order. And then we'll finish with vocabulary plus some more general accent rules. So if you're ready, let's get going. As a preface to this lesson, I want to ask you a question. What do you think is the first major obstacle that you are going to have to overcome on your journey to learning the language of the New Testament? Well, this might surprise you and sound a little strange, but it has nothing to do with Greek. I agree with William Mounce, who makes the argument that for many of you, you will need to overcome your lack of knowledge of English first. And he further says that many students do not know enough English grammar to learn Greek grammar. And so it's for this reason that we are going to begin speaking about English verbs and nouns before we learn about the Greek verbs and nouns. In other words, guys, you're going to have to learn to crawl before you walk. So with that said, let's begin crawling together. Let's begin by reminding ourselves of English verbs. So what is a verb? It says there, a verb is a doing or action word. All right, so doing or action word. So here's three examples. Firstly, he is studying Greek. So our main verb there is studying. But this might surprise you. Is also a verb. Specifically, it's a linking verb. And we'll learn more about this in the lessons that lie ahead. The second example, he jumped over the puddle. So there, jumped is functioning as the main verb of the sentence. And then finally, she drank her coffee quickly. Drank is the main verb of the sentence. So once again, a verb is a doing or action word. Now that we have reminded ourselves of what a verb is, let's move on to Greek verbs. So Greek verbs have 5 characteristics. And here is an overview of those 5 characteristics. They consist of a voice, a mood, a person, a number, and tense. So let's speak about each one of these individually now. The first characteristic of Greek verbs is that they have a voice. And voice tells us about the relationship of the subject to the action of the main verb. All right, so the relationship between the subject and the action of the main verb. So in Greek, we have 3 different types of voices. We have the active. The meaning of the active is that the subject performs the action of the verb. So the subject is doing the action. And the example there is John 3:16, which everyone should be familiar with. And there we see that God loved the world. God was doing the action. What was the action? He was loving the world. The second voice is the middle voice. Now, the middle voice is sometimes difficult to understand at first because there's not an English equivalent. And often the middle is used to convey the idea that the subject directly participates or is involved in the results of the action. So perhaps the easiest way to understand it, if you have a look there, the meaning, it says the subject acts in his own interest. So the example I've given you, and this is just one type of use of the middle voice, is from Matthew 27 verse 5, which tells us that Judas Iscariot went out and hung himself. All right, so Judas acted in his own interest, and that was written in the middle voice. Then the third type of voice is the passive voice, and the meaning there is the subject receives the action of the verb. So the example I've given there, if someone states, I am blessed by God, the subject, I, is not performing the action but is receiving something. In this case, the person is receiving a blessing. The one performing the act, however, is God. But grammatically, he is not the subject of the sentence. And similarly, if someone stated, I am blessed, then God would be the understood or implied agent who gives the blessing. All right, so those are our three types of voices: the active, the middle, and the passive. The second characteristic of Greek verbs is that they have a mood, and this describes the relationship of the verb to reality. I'd like to think of this as the author's attitude toward an event. The author's attitude toward an event. And in Greek, we get four types of moods. We get the indicative mood, and that number there in brackets indicates how frequently this mood occurs. So this occurs over 15,000 times in the New Testament, which is far more than all the other moods, as you can see. Then we have the subjunctive mood, which occurs about 2,000 times. Next, the imperative mood, 1,500 times. And finally, the optative mood, which occurs only about 70 times. So let's take a look at the meaning of each of these moods. Firstly, the indicative mood represents something as certain or asserted. So the indicative mood is used to make an assertion, and statements in the indicative mood do not necessarily indicate a fact. All right, that's important to note. So rather, the indicative has to do with the manner in which a statement is made and not the truth of the statement itself. So it's very possible that someone can lie or be mistaken while using the indicative mood. So here's an example of an assertion: he went fishing. Next, the subjunctive mood, the meaning, it represents something as probable. So the subjunctive mood represents the verbal action as indefinite but probable. So it's the mood of probability. And it often deals with something that might take place in the future. Right? It might happen. It's probable. So here's an example: whenever he goes fishing. Then we have the imperative mood, and the meaning there is represents something as intended or commanded. Right? So you can think of it as giving someone a command. So there's our example: go fishing! Exclamation mark. And then the fourth mood is the optative mood, which represents something as possible or hoped for. Just a comment here. Now, the optative mood was dying out in the Koine period during the time the New Testament was written, becoming absorbed by the subjunctive mood. So consequently, there are only 68 uses of the optative in the New Testament, which can be used to express a wish, a prayer, or something that is potential. So there's our example: I wish he would go fishing. So four moods: indicative, subjunctive, imperative, and optative. We'll do the third and fourth characteristics together, which are the person and the number. So the person tells us who the actor of the verb is, and the number will tell us whether the actor is singular or plural. So that information is communicated in this table. So the first characteristic is the person, and we can have either a first, a second, or a third person. The first person is the person speaking, the second person is the person being spoken to, and the third person is everything else. And then that person can either be singular or plural. So let's go through these together. The first person singular is I. The second person singular is you. Third person singular, he, she, or it. Onto the plurals. The first person plural is we. Second person plural is you. And third person plural is they. So it's probably best to get familiar with this table and to learn it off by heart going forward. I have left the tense for last because it is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of Greek verbs. But before we actually delve into the Greek tenses, I thought it best to first speak to you about English tense. So English tense refers to both time, that is when the action of the verb takes place, and the form of the verb. So we have three time frames which you should be familiar with already: the present, the past, and the future. So let's take a look at these in more detail. Firstly, the present. If you are watching this video right now, you could say something like I watch, which would be in the present tense. Or you could say I see the screen, and that verb see is in the present tense and indicates an action that is occurring in the present time. On the other hand, you could say that last night I watched the Greek lesson. So you would say I watched, and those two letters on the end there, the ed, would be used to indicate the past tense. So in the present, I watch, and then to change that to the past tense, we say I watched. And then the future time, you could perhaps say that tomorrow I will watch the rest of this Greek lesson. And we would use the helping verbs will to help us suggest or indicate the future time. All right, so that's an introduction to the English tense, and let's now move on to speaking about the Greek tense together. One of the challenges of moving from the English tense to the Greek tense is that the Greek introduces us to another component known as aspect. And aspect is perhaps the most difficult concept to grasp in Greek verbs, and yet it is the most important and most misunderstood. So William Mounce states in his book, the basic genius of the Greek verb is not its ability to indicate when the action of the verb occurs, but what type of action it describes. So because aspect is such a crucial concept to understand, I'm going to reserve a specific section to speaking about it and explaining it to you, and focus now on tense and time. Now, from the outset, I want to be very clear what I mean by these terms. When I use the term tense, I am only referring to the form of the verb. And when I use the term time, I am referring to when the action of the verb took place. So I don't want you to confuse tense and time. All right. In other words, I'm not using the term tense to refer to time. We're going to keep them separated, although there are times when they are related. So in Greek, we have 6 tenses or tense forms, as it were. We have the present, the imperfect, the aorist, the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future. And then time is similar to the English. We have present, past, and future. So the tense forms may be related to time. So the present tense form is sometimes related to present time, the future tense form to future time, and the imperfect, aorist, perfect, and pluperfect tense forms are related to past time. And generally, we will have to ascertain the time from the context in which the verb is found. So with that said, let's go on now to speak about what aspect is and look at the types of examples that we have. Okay, so I have the unfortunate job of trying to explain Greek aspect to you. So I hope that after this that you don't leave more confused than when you began. But the first thing I want to say is that the concept of aspect is often missing from traditional grammars because this concept is a fairly new development in the field of Greek linguistics. That was a mouthful, linguistics. And just as tense form is not the same as time, but it's related to it, so too aspect is not the same as tense, although it is related. So previously, we looked at 2 concepts of the Greek tense. So we said firstly, it talks about time, right? So when the action occurred, and number 2, tense form. And we said that there were 6 tense forms that you needed to be familiar with. All right, now aspect. Why aspect? Yes, it's difficult, but it's very important because it essentially forms the basic framework, as it were, for understanding Greek verbs. All right, so the basic framework. Now, this resource that you see in front of you is called Going Deeper with New Testament Greek. It is an intermediate study of Greek, which means it would be normally a resource that you would pick up after you've done 1 year of basic Greek. But I just want you to make you aware of it. It's an excellent resource, and if you do have the finances to buy it now, I would encourage you to do so. It's written by Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer, and they really help to flesh out some of these concepts that we're speaking about. But I'd like to take the liberty to use their definition of aspect and give that to you, so that when you think of aspect, this is the definition that I want you to lay hold of going forward. So they write, it is the subjective perspective or viewpoint from which an author communicates the action of a given verb. Right, so keywords here are perspective or viewpoint. from which an author communicates the action of a given verb. So guys, please learn that by memory and know it well. Because essentially the genius of the Greek verb is not its ability to just tell us when an action occurs, but it also tells us what type of action it describes. And the way that we consider that is by looking at it from the perspective or the viewpoint of the author, in this case the biblical author, and how he communicated the action of that verb. So the same authors of Going Deeper with New Testament Greek identify and describe three types of aspect, which they refer to as verbal aspect, a term that I'm going to adopt and use going forward in this series. So let's have a look at those three types of verbal aspect. The first one that they list is the imperfective. And in brackets there, we see that the present and imperfect tense forms are related to the imperfective verbal aspect. The second is the perfective, and that is related to the aorist tense form. And then finally we have the stative verbal aspect, which is like a hybrid of the first two, and that is related to the perfect and pluperfect tense forms. Here is a summary of verbal aspect. So the imperfective verbal aspect can be defined as an action that is viewed as in process or ongoing, and that's related to the present and imperfect tense forms, which is related to the present or past time. The perfective verbal aspect can be defined as an action viewed as complete, and that's related to the aorist tense form, which is related to past time. And then finally, we have the stative verbal aspect, which is defined here as state of affairs resulting from a previous action or state. And that's related to the perfect and pluperfect tense forms, which is related to past and present time. What I'd like to do now is try and give you an example of each of the verbal aspects to help make these concepts clearer for you. On the screen before you now is a diagram showing the imperfective as well as the perfective verbal aspects. So remember, verbal aspect is the subjective perspective or viewpoint from which an author communicates the action of a given verb. So let's begin with the imperfective verbal aspect, which we saw is defined as when an action is viewed as in process or ongoing. So let's say that the author or speaker is involved in the action of jumping, and he says something like, I am jumping, or I was jumping. So what is his perspective or viewpoint when he says that? Well, he's focusing on the action as it is in process, as it is ongoing, describing how it's happening. So he's not focused on the beginning or the end of the action. This is the essence of what we call the imperfective verbal aspect. On the other hand, the perfective verbal aspect we saw is defined as an action that is viewed as complete or as a whole. So in this case, using the same action of jumping, the author or speaker would say something like, I jump or I jumped, where their perspective or viewpoint is simply describing the action of jumping as a whole, without reference to the beginning, middle, or end, as occurring or as having occurred without regard for how it happened. All right, and this is what we mean by perfective verbal aspect. And then the final verbal aspect is the stative. So staying with our example of jumping, perhaps the author or speaker says something like, I have jumped or I had jumped, all right, where he describes an action that took place in the past but now has continuing results. So for whatever reason, perhaps he had jumped but not high or far enough, or just as he jumped, something important happened. All right, and the use of the stative aspect tells us that the results are important to understanding the present context, and that something will be said about it later. So that is what we mean by the stative verbal aspect. Now that we have covered the Greek verbs, let's move on to nouns. And as was the case with the verbs, we'll begin by looking at the English nouns first. So let's remind ourselves of what a noun is. It says there, a noun is a word which names a person or thing. So here's a sentence. It said, Jack replaced the tire of his car because it was flat. So in this sentence, Jack, tire, car are all examples of nouns. Let's begin with an overview of Greek nouns. They have three characteristics: gender, number, and case. So let's take a look at each one of these characteristics in greater detail. The first characteristic of Greek nouns is that they have gender, and there are three specific genders, namely masculine, feminine, and neuter. And neuter means neither in Latin. So let's first remind ourselves of English gender. It says that in English, gender usually follows natural sex. So for example, man is masculine, woman is feminine, and anything that is not male or female would be considered as neuter. But Greek is very different, as we're going to see. So it says there, it is good to be aware that little logic exists for a Greek noun's particular gender. So let me give you an example to demonstrate this. So we have the word korasion, which means little girl, and paidarion, which means little boy. She would expect little girl to be feminine and little boy to be masculine. However, both have a neuter gender. So that is why I say that little logic exists for a Greek noun's particular gender, and essentially one just has to learn the genders of the Greek nouns. So it is best to remember that gender, that is Greek gender, is a grammatical category, not a physical or natural one. So it does not correspond to natural sex. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And then finally, we just need to know that each Greek noun will only ever have one gender. All right, so the Greek genders do not change. The second characteristic of Greek nouns is that they have number. This is similar to verbs, which tells us whether the actor is singular or plural. So just a quick example. Students should learn to study like the student. All right, so there the students would be plural and student would be singular. Before we look at the final characteristic of Greek nouns, I feel that it's important to set some context for the discussion of speaking about the Greek cases. So I'd like to return to English and look at the basic building blocks of a sentence. So every sentence consists of a subject, a verb, and then if it's a transitive verb, then it needs to be followed by an object. And so we could say that every sentence needs a subject, a verb, and an object, but I prefer to use the term complement, which includes not only direct object, but phrases and clauses as well. Now, if a clause can stand by itself and as a completed idea, then we refer to that as a independent clause. And if the sentence cannot stand by itself and it is subordinate to the main clause, then we refer to that as a dependent clause. Right, so that is the basic building blocks of a sentence. So an English sentence is made up of a subject, a verb, and sometimes a complement. And the words that make up a sentence have cases. And case has to do with how those words are functioning in a sentence. And in English, word order is what determines their function. Word order is so vital in English that very little flexibility is permitted. So in English, you are not going to see the verb at the beginning of the sentence. So consistent with English structural orderliness, the subject comes before the verb and the verb is followed by the object. So let me demonstrate that with a simple example before us. The sentence says, Michael hit his ball to Jack. So we have Michael, which is the subject. That's followed by the verb, which is followed by the direct object, and that is followed by the indirect object. Right, so if these words were in different orders, then this sentence wouldn't make sense to us. So there needs to be a logical sequence to the order of the words, and that will then determine their function in the sentence. Just very quickly, to help you identify the direct object, you can ask yourself the question, who or what? So Michael hit who or what? In this case, it'll be what? His ball. And to identify the indirect object, you can ask yourself the question, to or for whom, or to or for what? And in this sentence, it would be to whom, and the answer is to Jack. Now that we've set some context for the discussion of Greek cases, let's now take a look at the actual Greek cases. So in Greek, we have 5 different cases. Let's name those together. We have the nominative, the genitive, the dative, the accusative, and the vocative. So if a word is in the nominative case, then it's going to tell us that the word is functioning as the subject. If it's in the genitive case, then it's showing us that the word is possessive. If it's in the dative case, it's telling us that the word is functioning as the indirect object. If it's in the accusative case, then the word is functioning as the direct object. And then the vocative Greek case shows us that the word is functioning as direct address. So previously, when we looked at word order in English sentences, I made the point that word order is vital and that there's very little flexibility that is permitted. So essentially, you will always have this pattern, the subject, the verb, and then the object. However, this is where Greek is very different. And the reason for that is because Greek is an inflected language. So it says there, Greek is a highly inflected language. Well, what does that mean? It means that words are able to change or be altered in many different ways. So essentially, the term inflection refers to the spelling changes that words undergo to reflect their grammatical function in a sentence. So grammatical function, as I've stated there, essentially equals case. And case helps us to understand the function of a word in a sentence, as I previously showed you with that English sentence. So with this background now, let's try to understand how cases operate in the Greek. So in English, we normally use word order to determine the function of a word. But in Greek, it is the case ending, not the word order, that indicates the function of a word. And therefore, it is extremely important to learn case endings. And in the next lesson, we'll begin learning some of those case endings. So in our example here, it says, hit Michael the ball to Jack. So this is potentially what you could have in Greek. You could have the verb at the front of a sentence, followed by the nouns. And the question would be, well, how do you know what is the subject, what is the direct object, and what is the indirect object? And the simple answer right now is that you would have to look at the endings of the words. So based on the knowledge that we have from the previous example, we would know that Michael is the subject because it would be in the nominative case. And the nominative case tells us that the word is functioning as a subject. The ball, which is the direct object, would be in the accusative case because the accusative tells us that the word is functioning as the direct object. And then the indirect object, to Jack, would be in the dative case. So the case endings, not the word order, indicate the function of a word. I think it's only fitting to finish with an example from the Greek New Testament. And as you can see, the example comes from John 3:16, which is probably the best known verse in the entire Bible. So I'm going to read the first line for us and then make some observations, which will hopefully solidify some of the concepts that we've been speaking about regarding Greek cases. So John says, Hutos gar agapesin ha theos ton kosmon. So keep in mind that in Greek, it is the case ending, not the word order, that indicates the function of a word. So let me demonstrate that for you. I realize we haven't learned any case endings yet, and we will do shortly, beginning in the next lesson. But here we have ha theos, and that is in the nominative case based on its ending, and therefore we know that God is the subject of the sentence. That's followed by ton kosmon, which is in the accusative case based on its ending. And the world therefore is functioning as the direct object. And then what is most striking is that the verb comes before the subject, and that's also based on its ending. So why would John have placed the verb before the subject? Well, very simply put, the Greek writers would often emphasize something, and that which they were emphasizing would be placed at the front of the sentence. So as you can see here, John is emphasizing the love of God and the fact that God demonstrated his love by sending his one and only Son to come and die for us, and that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So I hope that this example has just whet your appetite for further studies, and that it's just opening up a whole new world of possibilities and excitement regarding the study of the Word of God. Finally, we arrived at our vocabulary for lesson 2. And before we go through the words, I really want to implore you to learn the vocabulary. The more familiar you are with the Greek words, the easier it's going to be for you to read, and especially easier to do some translation. So let's have a look at these words together. We have akuo. Akuo means I hear, and in brackets we have takes a genitive or accusative. That means that this specific verb will take its object in the genitive or accusative case. Alright, so I'll do the verbs and the nouns in different colors. Alright, now we have anthropos ha, which means man. Next we have estin, and you see there the V, alright, which is the Greek nu in brackets. Why is that in brackets? Well, this is a movable nu, which means that if the word that is coming after this particular one begins with a vowel, then there will be a nu, but if there's a consonant, then the nu will drop out. So that means is, he is, she is, it is. Then we have theos ha, which is God. Next we have kai, which means and, sometimes also or even. Then we have kurios ha, which means Lord. Then we have lego, I say. Next we have logos ha, which is word. And then we have ha, and this is the first article that you are learning. So let me write that there, article, and that means the. And then finally we have huios ha. Notice the rough breathing marks, we put a H in front of it, and that means sun. Just a quick side note here that is quite important. If you have a look here, for example, we've got your anthropos ha. Alright, and actually all the nouns have this article coming after the noun. Alright, so this is the way that you will always find the lexical forms of words. Okay, but when you find these words in Greek, generally you will have the article in front of the noun. Alright, so just be aware of that difference. Lexical form, you always have the noun, then the article. The final thing that I've added to the end of this lesson are the general rules for accent. In the first lesson, we looked at some basic rules, so these are some more general rules. I just want to make it clear that I will not test you on these general rules, but for those of you that are curious to understand how the accents move and how they function, then this short video is for you.
And either vowels up here, and introduce some jargon. We'll use this jargon sometimes in class, and Hansen and Quinn uses it regularly. We need this because the next rules are about which syllables an accent can go over. First, ultima, which is Latin for last, and which we represent with a U for the last syllable. penult, which is short for penultimate, which is Latin for second to last, and we'll use a P to represent it when we're talking about the second to last syllable. And antepenult, which is a shortened form of Latin for the one before the second to last, or third to last, and that will be an A to represent the third to last syllable. Greek accents only appear over the last 3 syllables of a word. If a word is longer than 3 syllables, you'll only be working with the last 3 syllables when figuring out about accents. Acute accents can be over short vowels or long, and they can appear over the ultima, the penult, and the antepenult, any of the last 3 syllables. But if the last syllable, the ultima, is long, if it has a vowel that's long or a diphthong, except oi or I, then it's like it has extra gravity, and it won't let an acute be as far back towards the beginning of the word as it wants to be, which is often the antepenult. Again, if this last syllable is long, acutes can only go back as far as the penult. Here's an example. The word anthropos, which means man or human being, has a short omicron in the last syllable, so it's pronounced anthropos, and it has an acute on the first syllable, which happens to be the antepenult, the third to last, and that's where it likes to have that accent. But if we change the ending of the word to make it of a human being, anthropou, it no longer likes to have that acute as far back as the antepenult, and it kind of pulls it to over the omega in the middle to the penult, the second to last syllable. We'll go over lots of examples like that in class and in the videos to follow. Now, graves. They can go over short or long syllables or vowels, but they only appear on one syllable, the last, the ultima. Some words will expect an acute over the last syllable, and if that word is followed by another word and not a pause, the accent changes to a grave. That's really the only time you use a grave. So here's an example. Adelphos is the word for brother, and it likes to be accented on the last syllable. When you see it in the dictionary, it appears like it appears in the single word in the beginning of this example, with an acute over the last syllable. But if you put it into a phrase or a sentence with a word after it, like Adelphos kai mater, which means brother and mother, then it no longer likes to have an acute at the end of the word. It needs to change that acute to a grave. Same with kai, which has an acute in the dictionary, but in combination it changes to a grave because that's the last syllable. Mater's got an acute on the beginning of the word, and you don't have to worry about it with graves. Now we'll move on to circumflexes. They can only be over long vowels or diphthongs, and they can only appear over the ultima, the last syllable, or the penult, the second last. But again, if that last syllable is long, Greek gets uncomfortable with back as far as you can go to the beginning of the word, which is penult for circumflex. So if a circumflex is trying to be there, but the last syllable is long, the accent has to change to an acute. One more rule about circumflexes. Actually, let me first give you an example of what I just said. Doron, the word for gift, likes to have a circumflex over the second to last syllable, over that long omega. And it can because it has a short omicron in the last syllable. But if we make it of the gift, doru, that last syllable is a diphthong now, u, which is long, which means Greek is no longer comfortable with a circumflex over the second to last syllable, over the penult. So it changes to an acute. Okay, now for that last rule about circumflexes. If the last syllable is short and the second to last syllable is long, and the word needs an accent on the second to last syllable, and you'll need to learn some words to know when that is, and you don't really know enough words right now to know when that is, but it will come into play, then the accent has to be a circumflex. That is, again, if the last syllable is short and the second to last syllable is long, and the word needs an accent over the second to last syllable, it must be a circumflex. Really, you won't use that for a while. Don't worry about it too much. But that's what I needed to include for you to have all of the general rules.